Good evening and welcome to the Journey Home. My name is Marcus Grodi, your host for this live program, and I want to say right off the bat, those of you who are regular viewers of the Journey Home are going to notice a little bit different look here. We've got a new set. We're still tweaking it, so we'll see some changes as the weeks go on. We also, the opening was a little bit different, just tweaked a little bit. After 8 years, we improved on that just a little bit. The song is just a tad different, though we're not going to change the song. Everyone that's ever written the Journey Home says they love the songs. We're keeping that. Also, we have a new producer, Andrea Burns, who's been our producer for many, many years, did an excellent job. Her plate got a bit full here at EWTN, so she's going to focus her efforts on home video. And now our new producer is Steve Beaumont, who actually whose name you've seen on many EWTN programs. So pray for us as we go through this transition. But my guest tonight is Roy Schoeman. He's a Jewish convert to the Catholic faith. You're going to hear his story in just a bit. Educated at MIT and Harvard, management consultant, but he's got quite a story to tell. And you're an important part of our program, so right off the bat, I want to give you the phone numbers, 1-800-221-9460. If you're outside North America, you can give me a call at 205-271-2980. Or you can send us an email at journeyhome@ewtn.com. Roy, welcome to the Journey Home.
Thanks for having me.
It's, in fact, that you mentioned when I talked to you earlier that you watched the Journey Home off and on during the early days of the program, and it's great. I know that often the Journey Home program focuses on our Catholic audience, and I know at least our evangelical audience. Is it a help to Jews on the journey?
I think it's a wonderful illustration of the working of grace and of how active our Lord is in reaching out to people one by one and bringing them home.
Everybody's journey is a little bit different, but you always see that little hint of grace that really opened our heart, and I know from your story that's the key. So I'm going to get out of the way really quick and ask you if you could start by giving us that little summary of your spiritual background.
Okay. I'm Jewish. I consider myself still Jewish, by the way, more Jewish than ever. We can perhaps get into that later. I grew up Jewish in a suburb of New York City. My parents are German Jewish Holocaust refugees. They both got out safely, successfully. And I grew up in quite a Jewish environment. All my friends really were Jewish, and my life was revolved around being Jewish. I was quite devout growing up. Went to Jewish religious education all the way through until leaving high school. This basically analogous to CCD, an after-school program twice a week. And was bar mitzvahed, and really being Jewish was the center of my identity, and love of God was very important to me. And I felt I was connecting to God, and I think I was connecting to God through my Judaism and through my Jewish worship. At the very tail end of high school years, I became even more religiously oriented and even flirted very briefly with Hasidism and with some ultra-Orthodox forms of Judaism, but then I went to MIT. Pretty much fell away from religion under the influence of MIT's hyper-scientific. I'm not blaming MIT, right. But a lot of the people there, thought that science had all the answers to the mysteries of life and explained away religion. And
It'd be typical of an engineering school where the whole focus of the entire student body as well as the professors is really this scientific world and scientific.
That's right. There were exceptions. I mean, there were deeply religious people there, but I did not, end up in that track. And so pretty much fell away from religion, fell away from religious practice. Went to Harvard Business School, did very well there. Was invited back to join the faculty and ended up being a professor at Harvard Business School at 29. And that's really in some sense where my story begins, because I think that when one's striving for something, it's fairly easy to imagine that is a meaning to life. And once I achieve this goal, everything will make sense. This is really sort of the point of my life, is to do this, or to get into Harvard Business School, or to, do well there, or to, get invited to join the faculty. And then when one achieves all those things and finds that the emptiness really inside is just as great as ever, that's really sort of when the bottom falls out. And that's sort of what happened to me. And I found myself having done everything I could sort of imagine that should give my life meaning, but it still didn't have any meaning. There was really fundamentally no point to anything. And it was in that inner emptiness that in those days I found my greatest solace in nature, being alone in nature, just kind of introspectively. And I was doing that. I was walking on the beach on Cape Cod early one morning before anyone was out, and I received the greatest single grace of my life, which was from one moment to the next, I found myself in a very immediate, tangible sense, knowing that I was in the presence of God and looking at my life in His presence as though I was looking at it from after death.
I'm going to stop you there before we go into that, because I think that's such a powerful moment. I want to reflect on that. Back up just a second. I failed to mention something right at the beginning of the program that I want to do right now, is that Roy is the author of a wonderful book. Salvation is from the Jews, Ignatius Press. It's available from EWTN Religious Catalog. I didn't want to didn't want to do this to make it an infomercial, but the point being that those who are watching, listening to your story, the website was called Salvation is from the Jews.
That's right, salvationisfromthejews.com.
You know, if you're listening, especially if you're listening to the internet, you might check on the website to find out more about Roy and his journey. But what made me remember that is that in the back of your book, you have a short synopsis of your journey. And at this point, you mentioned the experience of another colleague that I found very interesting, because it so described this issue you're going through. I mean, here was a colleague that had fought all the battles for tenure, and what did he tell you? I mean,
that's right. This was when I was still on the faculty at Harvard. My mentor, actually, who was a very senior professor, department chair, chaired professor, tenured, world famous in the field, which was marketing. And he one day confided to me that the day after he was granted tenure, he almost quit and threw everything away and left Harvard, because here all his life had been focused towards achieving this one goal. And when he achieved it, he realized, that there was no real satisfaction there anyway. And he almost threw it all in.
It's interesting to think about the students that dedicate their lives to go to an institution like Harvard to sit at the feet of these great men and women, not realizing that the very stuff that they're being taught by these men and women are not fulfilling the lives of those who are teaching it. I mean, that real struggle in the midst of that. I'm not aiming a finger at Harvard by any means.
Well, it's been said, and I wish I had the memory to know the quote exactly, but we have a hunger inside that's made for God. We have a hole inside that's a God-shaped hole that is only going to be filled by God. And many people live with the illusion that it is a hole for something else, and something else will fill it, and it never does.
Now, between the time that you had basically left your Jewish life, faith, belief in God behind, whether you had actually rejected it or not, but at least put it up on the shelf, and this experience in the sand in Cape Cod, you went through a time of searching is not the right word, right?
No, that's right. First of all, let me say that in a funny way, I will not really grant that I left my Jewish faith behind. I certainly didn't leave my Jewish identity behind. I didn't leave behind the importance of being Jewish to me. I became an agnostic, somewhere in between agnostic and atheist. In other words, I lost faith in God. Yeah. Faith is a gift. But I didn't lose my Jewish orientation or my sense of loyalty or pride in being Jewish. I didn't feel like I was moving away from Judaism at all, but I mean, the world is full of all kinds of atheists and agnostics, including plenty of Jewish ones, and they're still Jewish. But I looked for other consolations. I got very involved in downhill skiing, and for a number of years looked to that actually as my fundamental consolation to give a sense of meaning and purpose to life.
At a really deep level too. I mean, you were very much several months in the Alps.
That's right. I would spend several months every winter skiing in the Alps, and in the beginning it worked pretty well. the excitement and the thrill and the ego gratification and the natural beauty and the physical beauty of relating to nature in that way did really bring a lot of consolation. But I think another phenomenon that's part of the human experience is that these artificial consolations never last. I mean, God lasts. Yeah. And the sense of satisfaction and the sense of fulfillment from having a relationship with the Lord, as you know very well, not only doesn't fade, but it deepens over time, and all of these other consolations fade over time.
And you did some traveling too. I think you said you went to Denmark. Was that another?
Well, I lived actually in Denmark for about 2 years, and that was also along the same lines. I mean, in other words, it was looking. There's a book by a Jewish convert out called "There Must Be Something More." That was his story. I mean, you know, all his life there must be something more. There must be something more until he found Christ. And it was sort of that spirit of there must be something more. So I looked to living in a more beautiful, more peaceful, more, in some sense, higher quality of life place, Denmark. But again, that did not satisfy.
One other thing before we move on, I really don't understand from experience the different kinds of Jewish groups, you know, and often we'll run into secular Jews who are Jews, but they seem to have no faith whatsoever. It's not even an important thing for them. And often for many, the bar mitzvah is like just a rite of passage, moving on. It sounds like yours was much more than that.
That's right. Well, first of all, I did have the gift of faith. I mean, I was God-oriented. I was pious, you know, and devout. But I would again perhaps nuance a little bit what you said, which is that I think that coming from a Catholic context or even a Christian context, one thinks of one's religion primarily in terms of faith and having faith, and that's not really true in a Jewish context. Jews can feel very deeply Jewish, and being Jewish can be the most important thing in the world to them without them even being convinced that God exists. And I will argue that there's a certain legitimacy to that if you look at it almost from God's point of view, because the Old Covenant, the covenant which gives Jews their election, is not primarily a covenant dependent on faith. It's a covenant primarily dependent on being the seed of Abraham, on race. And so it might actually be internal that the sense of Jewish identity is much more brought forth from simply being Jewish racially than the sense of Catholic identity is brought forth from being, you know, descended from Catholics.
All right, now you had this powerful experience on the beach. Let's talk about that in more detail. Something you certainly didn't expect or were looking for, searching for.
I didn't expect it. Although I'll spend the rest of my life thanking God for giving me that unexpected and undeserved gift. I had the privilege of seeing my life as though I were looking at it from after death and seeing everything that I would be pleased about and everything that I would wish I had done differently. And I saw that everything that I did, and everything that anyone does, has a moral content for good or for bad, which matters for all eternity. I saw that my two greatest regrets when I died would be every hour that I wasted doing nothing of value in the eyes of heaven. And my other great regret would be all the time and energy I wasted worrying about not being loved, when every moment of my existence I was being held in a bath of love, a sea of love, greater than I could imagine, from this all-knowing, all-loving God. One of the deepest aspects of this experience was just realizing that God actually knew me by name, that He knew who I was, that He cared about me, knew me, had arranged every event in my life intentionally to be the most perfect thing that He could arrange for me. But I had not had this sense growing up. I think Christians in some sense have an advantage here, because they are sort of taught that, you know, Jesus knows you, Jesus loves you. My sense growing up was that there was a tremendous dignity to who I was, and a tremendous dignity and importance to being Jewish, which I will still argue and maintain is true. But not that, you know, if you ask God, hey, do you know that Roy Schoeman? He'd say, oh yeah, I remember when he was 5 and did this, you know. So the sense of being seen by God and being known by God was a profound part of this. And I knew from one moment to the next the meaning and purpose of my life was to worship and serve this God who was revealing himself to me. And I prayed to know his name so I could know what religion to follow. And I remember standing there and saying, let me know your name so I know how to worship you properly. I don't mind if you're Buddha and I have to become Buddhist. I don't mind if you're Apollo and I have to become a Roman pagan. I don't mind if you're Krishna and I have to become Hindu, as long as you're not Christ and I have to become Christian. It's perhaps too long a tangent to go into entirely what lies behind that. But there is a sense that I had, obviously, in some fundamental way, Judaism and Christianity is actually the same religion separated by a point of fact, which is who was Jesus. And if Jesus really was the Jewish Messiah, then Christianity is actually, in some sense, the correct form of Judaism, the continuation of Judaism after the coming of the Messiah. And if Jesus wasn't the Messiah, then Christianity is a sort of apostasy off of Judaism. So they're not unrelated religions at all. They are, more intimately related than is possible in the normal course of events for two religions. And I think that's where this resistance came from accepting that it might be Christ and it might be Christianity. So I didn't know. He did not reveal himself to me, and I think that I was unwilling to hear it if he had told me. But I went back to Cambridge, where I was living, continued my life as a management consultant, fundamentally happy in a way, maybe for the first time in my life, because I knew that God really existed and I knew the meaning of my life, but I still really wanted to know who he was. So every night before going to sleep, I would say a short prayer to know the name of my Lord and Master who had revealed himself to me on the beach. And a year to the day after the initial experience, I went to sleep. I felt as though I was woken by a hand on my shoulder, although I know this was in fact in the context of a dream. The way it felt was that I was woken, that I was taken to a room and left alone with the most beautiful young woman I could imagine. And I knew without being told that it was the Blessed Virgin Mary. And she said she would answer any questions that I wanted to ask her. So I asked her 4 or 5 questions. And then she said she had something she wanted to tell me. And, she went through something she had wanted to tell me. And then the audience was over. And I went back to sleep. And the next morning when I woke up, I was in some sense hopelessly in love with the Virgin Mary, and I knew that it had been Christ on the beach. So that's the nutshell version of my conversion story, although, again, just as I say that I consider myself still a Jew and more Jewish than ever, I also don't really consider it a conversion. It's coming into the fullness of the truth of Judaism, which in fact reflects far more dignity and glory to the state of being Jewish than I had any idea before my conversion, because what could be a greater honor than being the people who are chosen to bring God to man in the flesh?
Especially when you can think of conversion as a turning more fully in God's direction. You're still on the journey, but you're turning your focus more in His direction as opposed to the distractions of life and other alternative gods. I mean, that's what conversion is. And so a completed Jew is turning it fully in the direction of Jesus.
But conversion usually implies turning away from something.
Yeah,
and all of Judaism is contained within Christianity. Yeah. There's nothing in Judaism which is rejected by Christianity.
Right. Which is, I want to get to later, because I think that is such an important point that sadly too many Christians don't recognize today. But I'll go back to here though. So now you recognize as Christ, you're deeply in love with Mary. Are you a Catholic?
No, I woke up that morning and I was in love with Mary. I knew that I wanted to become as good a Christian as possible, but I had no idea what a Catholic was, what a Protestant was, what the difference was. And I really didn't have much recourse other than to open the phone book and to look for a church. And I bounced around a little bit in some Protestant churches, but my love for the Blessed Virgin Mary usually resolved that situation pretty quickly, because as soon as I got to know the pastor, I would ask, and by the way, what about the Blessed Virgin Mary? And if he didn't hold her in the kind of esteem which I thought was her right, I knew this is no place for me. And the other aspect of this was that I mean, I really was in some sense in love with her. I would spend a lot of time at Marian shrines simply to sort of sense her presence to some extent there. And Marian shrines are all Catholic, at least in the United States they certainly are. And there would frequently be masses going on at the shrines. And I just, I frankly wanted to receive the Eucharist, even though I didn't know what it was. I would just be there, and my heart would be leaping out saying, you know, essentially, excuse me for putting it this way, but give me, give me, give me. You know, I want, I want, I want. And without even really knowing where that hunger was coming from. So between having a devotion to the Virgin Mary and wanting to receive Eucharist, that did a pretty good job of directing me towards the Catholic Church.
How much longer did it take before you actually?
So it actually took 4 years between that dream and between being baptized. But it only took about 18 months before I knew I wanted to be baptized in the Catholic Church. But then it took about another 2 years to find basically to find a priest who understood where I was coming from and who could guide me correctly into the church.
That's an important issue, because I even find it not just for Jewish converts, for want of a better word, but Presbyterian, Baptist, Methodists, to understand the journey that we've come from this other tradition into our new tradition, to understand who we now are as Catholics, and to help us fill in the right gaps and leave behind the things that need to be left behind, as well as appreciate the wonderful gifts that are called to be brought in. I think that's a key part of your Jewish entrance into the Catholic Church. Did you find someone? How long did it take to find someone that could help you appreciate your Jewishness, that it wasn't something to be left behind?
That wasn't the problem. The problem was, how long did it take me to find somebody who didn't try to convince me all God wanted was that I should be a good Jew. I'm sorry to be indiscreet, but
that's
was
a
more
sad
the problem.
reality of today. Okay.
That was more the problem. I think that there are a lot of advantages to being born Catholic, but in some ways it's easier to see things from the outside than from when one grows up within it. And I think it's sort of silly that sometimes Catholics feel that to evangelize a non-Catholic is an intrusion upon them, or sort of being unfair to them, or being uncharitable. When in fact, if you're sitting on this gold mine, you know, and somebody says, hey, give me some of that gold, you say, no, you don't really need it. That's hardly charity. I mean, charity is to throw open the doors and say, welcome in.
Yeah. But that's a good point. I mean, I'm glad you said that very much. We need to take that at heart, folks. I mean, this whole hyper-ecumenism that has infected our understanding of our faith. But also, were you able to find a priest, though, that helped appreciate your Judaism and build on that, or was that later after you came into the church?
Nothing made me appreciate my Judaism as much as understanding the truth of the Catholic faith. In other words, I didn't need a priest to help me appreciate my Judaism. I fell in love with my Judaism in an entirely new way and in a far more intense way once I realized what Judaism was, which was Jews being the intermediary to bridge the gulf between God and man.
Is that the theme of your book? Talk about how that led then to your book, Salvation is from the Jews.
It seemed the relationship between Judaism and Christianity seemed entirely obvious to me, and it seemed almost puzzling to me that it wasn't universally seen that way and understood that way in Christian circles and in Catholic circles. That, I mean, the true glory and importance of Judaism is only reflected through its role in truly bringing the Messiah to all mankind, bringing God to mankind, bringing salvation to mankind. The Catholic Church, Catholic means universal, right? I mean, the intimacy is now available between God and man to all of mankind universally, hence the Catholic Church. Prior to the incarnation of God as man, that intimacy was only available to the Jews. It was like an ethnic privilege given to the Jews, which was universalized with the incarnation of the Messiah and with the Catholic Church. Everywhere you look, Judaism is ennobled by looking at it illumined in the light of Christianity, and that is what I wanted to convey.
All right, well, that book of Salvation is from the Jews Ignatius Press, and as I mentioned earlier, it's available on the religious catalog. We're going to take a break and come back in just a moment with some of your questions for Roy Schoeman. See you in a bit. Welcome back. Roy, before we take our first caller, how did your friends and family respond to your decision, your journey? Even a publication of a book about it.
As I said, the difference between Judaism and Christianity is fundamentally revolves around an issue of fact. Who was Jesus? Obviously, also, a Jew who does not become Christian thinks that Jesus was a false Messiah, and therefore the situation that I'm in is one of apostatizing from the truth to being deluded and entering a kind of illegitimate offshoot sect. So it can't come as good news. Having said that, I am far more surprised and pleased by the amount of love and supportiveness that I get from my family and friends, and I am dismayed by it.
Well, praise God for that. Great. All right, let's take our first caller. This is, I think it's Tom from, didn't get Tom from New York. Hello, Tom. What's your question tonight?
Good evening, Marcus. I have a question for Mr. Schoeman. I am, in listening to this, I am seeing very clearly how Judaism and Catholicism seem to be naturally related, like there would be this progression from Judaism to Catholicism, the appearance of the church, the tabernacle, the idea of the sacrifice of the Mass. It seems like a Jewish person would feel quite at home converting from Christianity, from Judaism into the Christian Catholic Church. What I'm amazed at is that there would be Jews who would become evangelical Protestants. It seems like it'd be a very foreign experience to them, and I'm wondering what you think about that and why that happens.
I think that one of the reasons it happens is because they're being evangelized by evangelical Protestants. Were they to be evangelized by Catholics, the outcome might be different. And I agree with you 100%. I think it's far more natural, the sense of the sacred, the sense of the highness of the liturgy, of the sacrificial, almost sacrificial nature of the liturgy, mostly the sense of the sacredness and the apartness of the sacred is far more resonant in the Catholic Church than it is in Protestantism. I think even there are, thank God, a fair number of Jews who have come into the Catholic Church via evangelical Protestantism, and I think that they concur that it's much more Jewish feeling in the Catholic Church, or the Catholic sacramental life is far more Jewish feeling than the Protestant way of worship.
Well, certainly within Catholicism, we've continued and preserved most of the continuity, the connections with Jewish life, Jewish ritual life. I mean, we've had the continuity. We're often in different traditions of Christianity, different aspects of it are truncated or set aside. And especially just the idea that you're certainly a part of the family of God.
I remember one of my early experiences, I spent some time in a Carthusian monastery even before I was baptized, and I was amazed because I would go to the divine office, which they spent probably about 5 hours a day chanting the divine office, And there would be all of these monks standing there for hours singing about essentially being Jewish, because it was all the Psalms. So, about Jerusalem and Israel, and should I forget thee, Jerusalem, let my tongue wither, or let my hand wither and my tongue cleave to the roof of my mouth. And they were all pretending to be Jewish, and there I was really Jewish. I felt very at home.
Let's take our next caller, and this caller is someone that EWTN viewers will recognize, Alice von Hildebrand. Hello, Dr. von Hildebrand.
Well, I'm sorry, I cannot hide my incognito. At any rate, I thank you very much for your superb presentation, which is very deeply moving. I read your book with passionate interest, but having spent my life with atheists and secularists, I thought to imagine that if they watched this show, they would put the following question to you. There is a brilliant young man who has fallen prey to an hallucination, and this dream about this beautiful woman is something that calls for psychoanalysis. Now, I know that people who have some spiritual experience know that Catholic masters have norms to distinguish between fake apparitions and true ones. Could you kindly enlighten your viewers on this?
Thank you, Dr. And Alice, and also remind you, I do have a note on my desk. I'm going to return that phone call this week, but thank you very much for that call. Thank you. That's actually a wonderful point. I mean, I'm glad she called that out, because there is the imitator. And you even mentioned in a private conversation about in other aspects of life how, in the midst of skiing, you can be deluded into hearing the visions. How can you tell the authenticity of it?
I actually waited a few years before telling all of my Jewish family and acquaintances about my conversion or my coming into the fullness of post-Messianic Judaism. And the reason was precisely, I can't sit here and say, I'm not a delusional, paranoiac, hallucinating, but I can say that this happened 18 years ago now, and I have certainly behaved more responsibly than I ever have before in my life, and have reflect far more peace and responsibility. So if this is a form of insanity, it's pretty atypical, because usually one doesn't maintain the illusion of being normal and productive and responsible for all that long after going crazy.
Another thing, though, is that you also continued to examine, and I know that you're a reader in mystical theology, spiritual theology, which helps discern, right?
That's right. And as a matter of fact, one of the things I loved about the Catholic Church when I first exposed myself to it after these experiences was, here they were essentially mystical experiences, which, very rightly are viewed with a great deal of suspicion. But the first Catholic author I in fact read was St. Teresa of Avila, right? So I thought, hey, this is fantastic. The Catholic Church can't throw me out on my ear because I've had mystical experiences, because you're hard-pressed to find read a saint who doesn't talk about them. So of all of the religious denominations out there, in some sense, the Catholic Church has more respect for the extraordinary forms of grace with which God works with man than the others.
And particularly like what John of the Cross talks about in the Ascent of Mount Carmel with these issues, he tells us not that our whole religious life is not to be focused on them. They are a way that God communicates with us. We are to yield and discern what it is that he is teaching us in that moment, and then move on with him, not make that the focus of our lives.
That's right. And I think the ultimate test is essentially moral behavior, responsibility, how constructive and productive one is after the experience.
Let's take this first email. Jeff comes from Jeffrey Jones in Loma Linda, California. Is it okay for Jews to continue keeping the Sabbath in Catholicism?
Well, first of all, they have to keep the Sabbath. The only question is the Sabbath on Saturday or on Sunday? Because, in fact, the reason for the Sunday obligation is it's the Catholic Church's interpretation of the requirement to observe the Sabbath and keep it holy, right?
So how do you deal with that in your journey?
Well, again, one of the great advantages of understanding what the Catholic Church is, as opposed to becoming a Messianic Jew or finding one's way into evangelical Protestantism, is I don't have to reinvent the wheel. This issue was hashed out in the first century. I cannot say out of myself why, how I could determine for certain that God wanted the Sabbath moved from Saturday to Sunday, but the apostles figured that out, right? Or at least the church in the first century figured that out, and with the guarantee of infallibility given to the teaching magisterium of the church, correctly discerned that the Sabbath had been moved to Sunday to celebrate, I think, fundamentally to celebrate the Lord's resurrection. So I don't have to worry about it. I just have to trust the church.
In fact, you have that continuity with the authority in the early church given by Christ through the gift of the Holy Spirit is a continuity, a parallel with the understanding of the authority that was in Moses, authority that was in the hierarchy of the old church that would define the rules of the Jewish people of God. I mean, that was just a continuity of understanding. Of course, the church had the authority to decide that the Sabbath would be on.
The other thing that Jews who become Christian are sometimes confused about is they think they're the first Jews to become Christian, and they forget that all of the early Christians were Jews who had become Christian. So we're not the first people to worry about these things. When Peter and Paul worried about these things, they were worrying about them from exactly the same perspective of being Jews who entered the church.
Let's take our next caller. This is Susan from North Carolina. Hello, Susan. What's your question?
Hi, Marcus. I love your program.
Thank
you so much. I have a question for Roy. Roy, could you please explain what it means to be Jewish? And the second question is, if you believe in Christ as a Savior, how do you view the Jewish people who are non-believers, and how would you think you could bring them to the faith, kind of wake up into this reality?
Thank you, Susan.
The first question was, what does it mean to be Jewish? I wrote a book about what it means to be Jewish, and there's a reason it had to be 300 pages long, but it actually starts with the fall of man. With the fall of man, when Adam fell, God wanted to reestablish this state of intimacy between God and man. He wanted to do that through having the second person of the Most Holy Trinity incarnate as man, and if he was going to do that, he in some sense had to, I know that's not quite the right word, but in some sense he had to pick a people into whom the second person of the Holy Trinity would incarnate and prepare that people for that role. And that's the fundamental meaning in some sense of being Jewish, is having the honor of belonging to that people that God chose for that role. There's a more mysterious aspect to it, which is what's the meaning of being Jewish in between the first and second coming of Christ. And that is far more of a mystery, but thanks be to God, I think the scriptures are fairly clear that there is a meaning, that God did not annul his election of the Jews, and that the Jews still have a special and unique role to play in the economy of salvation in between the first and second coming of Christ. So I think being a Jewish Catholic is in some sense to be twice blessed. There's still a blessing to the election, on top of which there's a blessing to the truth of Catholicism and to the participation in the sacramental life. As to the situation of Jews who do not recognize who Jesus is, again, I defer to the teaching authority of the Church. I know that it's a very complex issue. The role of formal membership in the Church in salvation and in the economy of salvation, but there's no question that in general one is crippled by not being Catholic. But if the Eucharist really is the body, blood, soul, and divinity of God, God, the God-man, then obviously one's at a great disadvantage not participating in that. And it's a double tragedy in the case of a Jew because it belongs to him. St. Paul says, essentially the Gentile Catholics are a part of that relationship through adoption, but the Jew isn't, I don't want to say entitled, but he comes into that relationship as the son in a way, as opposed to the adopted child. So it's almost a greater loss. Well, I can't say that. That's not really fair. But anyway, there's something particularly poignant about a Jew not coming into his own inheritance in that way.
I mean, to a real extent, this whole issue of no salvation outside the church and that whole issue that we're kind of dancing around a little bit is not a doctrine of the church to be used for judgment anyway. It's to be used for the spur for evangelization. We're called to tell.
That's right.
Not sit on the pile of gold, share it.
That's right.
That's what it's all about.
That's right. It's the greatest treasure that God ever gave man, and it is something I think one will be held to account for at judgment of not sharing it.
All right, let's take our next, let's go with our next email. I think one of the questions in the middle of this email we already focused on, but at least a couple of them here we can, the first one, what happened to the Pharisees? Do they still function as the religious leaders today? Another question was, what do the Jewish faithful believe the Messiah will do for them now if he were to come as they believe? Third question, what do the Jewish faithful believe about life after death? Do they believe in a resurrection? Is Sheol the same as purgatory? There's a lot of questions in there, but maybe one about the Pharisees. Do they still exist to some extent?
What at the time of Jesus was the sect of the Pharisees, the Pharisaical strain of Judaism, has become Judaism. Essentially, with the destruction of Jerusalem and the final dispersal of the Jews from Jerusalem and the Holy Land, the strain of Judaism which survived is the strain of the Pharisees. They were the dominant force in developing what's called rabbinical Judaism. And obviously, the Judaism of the Old Testament could no longer be followed once the temple was destroyed. The temple was at the center of Jewish liturgical life, and it was absolutely required for the removal of sin, for the atonement of sin, temple sacrifices. So Judaism to some extent had to be reinvented in the absence of the temple, and that the rabbis who kind of reinvented it, redefined it, determined how we should go on from here were the vast majority of them coming from the tradition of the Pharisees.
Well, given that then, the second question here, if the faith in many words was reinvented, and if they didn't accept Jesus as a Messiah, well then what would this strain of Judaism be looking for now in a Messiah? What would they expect him to do or be?
It's really
Are they still looking?
The sacramental life had to be reinvented. That aspect of Judaism had to be reinvented. The faith aspect didn't have to be reinvented. It's basically the liturgical role of the sacraments. And as far as what do Jews believe about what the Messiah will do when he comes, and what do they believe about the afterlife? There are a lot of answers to that. One is that, again, one of the treasures of the Catholic Church is you can actually say, what does the Catholic Church believe about something? You know where to look. There's one voice that speaks for the Catholic Church, which is the magisterium. That's not the case in Judaism. And there's no single authority that really has the authority to say, what Jews are supposed to believe. And even in Christianity, there's a wide spectrum of what people believe, and there is just as much so in Judaism. I would say that the issue of what will happen when the Messiah comes has always been ambiguous, whether it would be a temporal restoration of the Jewish nation, or whether it would be more like entering into heaven, a kind of resurrection of the dead. That ambiguity is even there in the Talmud, and is discussed in the Talmud. So there's no simple answer to that. The afterlife, there's a simpler answer, because at least in the Talmud, the afterlife is portrayed quite explicitly in terms of essentially heaven and hell. But again, Jews are not bound to believe the theology of the Talmud. And I think Jews today, the most common view that I have found expressed among Jews, when I was entirely participating in the Jewish world, is yes, there is an afterlife, but we don't really know much about it, and we don't really worry much about it, and we will trust God to deal with that, which is almost the view that's reflected in the book of Job, by the way. That I know that I will be taken care of. I know that God will be fair to me, but I don't know too much else.
Trust God.
Trust God.
With all your heart. All right, let's take our next caller, Lori from Colorado. Hello, Lori. What's your question?
Hello, Marcus.
Hello.
My question for Mr. Schoeman is how do Jews, for the most part, view Edith Stein? And my question for Marcus is, what is the name of that hauntingly beautiful theme song?
The theme song. Actually, the theme song is called River of Grass. And I think if you go to the Everglades website, they have some music. And actually, I think on one of the records, you can get the theme song called River of Grass. But Edith Stein was a big part of your journey, right?
Yeah, she was my first real hero coming into the church. But a Jew has no choice but to view her as an apostate. And I think it's easy to view her as a particularly tragic apostate because, essentially, because of the role she's taken in the Catholic Church. So she's not only an apostate in that she fell into this, false offshoot of Judaism, which is, Christianity, but also she has been canonized. I think the Jewish view is to some extent that she's been canonized by the Catholic Church for her apostasy, as opposed to all the Jews who perished in the Holocaust as good Jews. So there's something particularly difficult to swallow about her canonization, because it's sort of like you pick the one bad Jew to canonize who perished in the Holocaust instead of the 6 million good Jews or non-apostate Jews. So I think that's a kind of natural
but it's based on a misunderstanding, of course, misunderstanding of her and the Church's view of canonization.
That's absolutely. But those misunderstandings are not in short supply.
Are very deep. Let's try and see if we get at least one more email in. This comes from Stephen of Ocala, Florida. Dear Marcus and Roy, I was wondering if it was necessary to evangelize the Jews.
Jesus thought it was pretty necessary. He spent his life doing it. I don't remember too many Gentiles that he evangelized. Actually, there were one or two, but very, very few and far between. And he kept saying things to his disciples like, go first to the lost sheep of the house of Israel.
Right.
And I think he said to the Syrophoenician woman when she asked him for to heal her daughter, he said, I come only for the lost sheep of the house of Israel. So if it's good enough for Jesus, I think it's good enough for
They were
us.
to go forth and make disciples of all nations, beginning in Jerusalem, Judea, Samaria, and to the ends of the earth.
That's right.
Well, that says pretty clearly about our call to that. There's a confusion about that today because it seems, right, it's used that nasty word proselytization is stamped on any effort we made to reach out to those with the fullness of the faith.
That's right, and another word that I don't even understand, triumphalism, like somehow it's an expression of arrogance to try to invite people into your gold mine.
Yeah, and into the beauty of what God's given us. All right, I don't know if I can read this email, and I'll get my reading glasses on here. This maybe real quickly comes from Sarah in Boston, Massachusetts. She writes, Dear Roy, do you have any plans of writing another book, and what would be your subject?
I think the next book that will come out that I am involved in will be a book of stories of Jews who have found the fullness of Judaism in the Catholic Church.
Very good. Which is the one that you mentioned in your book, the man who had also a vision.
One of the things that strikes me, and one of the reasons I want to write this book of Jewish convert stories, so to speak, is precisely because they're very often very extraordinary experiences. I think it may take them to bring a Jew to overcome his resistance to Christianity. So there are a lot of very beautiful, extraordinary stories of conversions.
For Protestants, it takes a 2x4. For Jews, it's about 12x15 or something.
Yeah, that's...
All right. Well, we're going to take another break, and we'll be back in just a moment with some final thoughts for the journey home. Roy, thank you for joining us. I know from emails, phone calls, and other letters that we have Jewish viewers that watch the Journey Home regularly. If you were talking to them, what would you want to say to them to encourage them to make the same journey you've made?
Well, I'd say what I would encourage them to do in order to grow closer to God and to come into the realize the full promise of Judaism. I wouldn't want them to make the same journey I made because of anything I said, but I would want them to open themselves up to God's grace as fully as possible, and suspect that might lead them in that direction, which would first of all be take Judaism extremely seriously, take the Old Testament seriously, read the prophets, and think seriously about what they're saying and what it all means. Look at what Judaism was all about before the 20th century, because Judaism has been tainted, like has Christianity, by modernism and by a kind of secular rationalist worldview. Through the Middle Ages, there was no Judaism without a lively expectation of the coming of the Messiah. It was always about the coming of the Messiah. So start thinking about what the promise of the Messiah was, what Jews knew about the coming of the Messiah, and most of all, I would actually say pray to the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Pray if you're inclined to pray to Jewish saints, to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob themselves, and pray that essentially, if Jesus is the Jewish Messiah, let me know. And if I'm not willing to hear that, pray, okay, I'm not willing to hear that, but if Jesus is the Jewish Messiah, make me willing to hear it. And I think that God will hold up his end. I think the only thing that is stopping God's grace from working in any human soul is our free will, our freedom to resist that grace. And if we open up to that grace, God will do the rest.
All right, Roy. Well, thank you very much.
Thank you.
God bless you. Thank you for joining us. Thank you for sharing your journey. I want to remind you at home of his book, Salvation is from the Jews, Ignatius Press. You can get it on Religious Catalog. I also want to remind you that, and salvationisfromthejew.com is the website.
That's right.
March for Life, 2 weeks away. If you're planning to go, make sure you got a hotel room. But otherwise, make sure you're there watching and praying as we cover this event. It's an important time. We've got to pray for the power of God's grace to empower our leaders and our country to take this issue seriously. All right? We're in this together. God bless you. I'll see you again next week.